Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's time to start our roundtable. I'm very pleased to open this very interesting roundtable dedicated to memory of and from Vietnam, between time and narrative. I admit that as a historian of the socialism in Bulgaria, for me, the link between time and narrative has always been something that, bothers my mind. I think that the link between those two categories is memory, personal memory, collective memory, but also shaped by current reality and many other layers of memory, past and present. So here in Bulgaria, I think we still have issues with our past, to reconcile with our past, and especially with the period of socialism. We still tend to either go to glorification of this period and nostalgia, or going to the other extreme and declaring the period totally bad and dark and even criminal period, which of course is not true. So the truth is somewhere in the middle, and there is not only one truth about the period of socialism. So I'm sure that in terms of dealing with our recent past, we might have many things in common with Vietnam. And actually, I am looking forward to learn from you more about this. And just as a very, very short introduction to the topic today, I would like to remind you that Bulgaria and Vietnam established diplomatic relations in 1950 and signed a mutual agreement to cooperate in cultural and educational affairs. As a result, the first Vietnamese students arrived in Bulgaria in 1960. And the main subject that they came to study were agriculture, economics, tourism, humanities, arts, medicine, and construction. According to an international agreement of 1980, Bulgaria, along with other Comecon members, accepted Vietnamese guest workers in the country as a relatively cheaper manual labor workforce. According to one estimate, over 35,000 Vietnamese people have worked in Bulgaria between 1980 and 1991. 35,000. And 5,000 Vietnamese students have completed their higher education in various Bulgarian universities. The idea was initially to compensate Bulgaria's lack of sufficient manual workforce, and at the same time to relieve Vietnam of some of its growing population, with the trained workers potentially coming back. So when the transition period in Bulgaria came at the end of 1989, out of thousands of Vietnamese, all but the students and those who had merit in Bulgaria left. So we have still a Vietnamese community and mostly, of course, mixed marriages. And they have established a presence among the vendors in Sofia's well-known and frequented Bazaar Ilianci and in some other areas. And many Vietnamese people who studied in Bulgaria became experts in different fields and came back to Vietnam. So they contributed as high-profile experts when they returned to Vietnam. In 2008, Bulgaria, already a member of the European Union, started looking to employ Vietnamese workers again. The tourism boosted between the two countries in the recent years. And when this year the President of Bulgaria visited Vietnam on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between the two countries, he underlined the strong friendship foundation, the bright trade economic cooperation prospects, and the close education, culture, and people-to-people ties. So I'm very pleased today to see many representatives of these people-to-people ties, first of all. And now I'm pleased to give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Raia Apostolova from the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. She will speak about rescuing memory. How did Vietnamese workers arrived in and departed from Bulgaria. Dr. Apostolova, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. And of course, I would like first to thank the organizers for putting together such a rich in knowledge conference. And when I was preparing for this conference, I couldn't help but notice that state and media narratives, surrounding the 75th anniversary invites us to think about these thousands of Vietnamese students and workers that lived in Bulgaria before the disintegration of socialism, of course, as a solid base upon which our traditional friendship must continue its course. To operationalize this friendship, it is almost expected from us that we reach out to a memory that is a long time gone, differentiatedly remembered, and for many, never known or even forgotten. And to turn it into a peculiar type of a diplomat, a peculiar type of attaché, who will secure both our past and future friendships. Yet, we are all aware that friendships, like any other relationship, they're not static, they're constantly reinvented, reinterpreted, and contested. And I will try today to pluralize our memory of that friendship between Bulgaria and Vietnam, perhaps take it into troubled times and spaces. Around the 1950s, during the decolonial processes in the Global South, the production and training of cadres became an intersectional point for socialist and decolonial theory, political theory. At the time, there was no doubt that Vietnam had taken the route towards socialism, and as such, it became an important ally to the People's Republic in Eastern Europe. We are safe to say, I think, that for decades, Vietnam was the epitome of what an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggle must entail. From the Bandung Conference in 1955 through the anti-war movements in the United States and the people's effort in Eastern Europe to aid the struggle of the Vietnamese heroic peoples, the country became a symbol of the aspirations of more than half of humankind for an alternative future, freed from racially coded and cultural dominations, economic international inequalities, and colonial forms of governance. It is in this context of decolonization that the figure of the foreign cadre became a central sociological figure mediating the relationships between the so-called second and third worlds and between Vietnam and Bulgaria. At that historical conjuncture, the cadre was imagined actually as an absent reality in the post-colonial context. In turn, this absent reality carried a dual strategic charge within the socialist imaginary, both as an obstacle to the realization of a future socialist society and as an obstacle to Vietnam's victory in the American War. It is in this context as well that Bulgarians, specialists, teachers, etc., set foot towards Vietnam, and tens of thousands of Vietnamese citizens arrived in Bulgaria to study, work, and increase their qualification. I would like to dissipate all doubts here. The arrival of Vietnamese citizens in Bulgaria was a mutual interstate effort, an effort that didn't involve some cynical economic pragmatism or because of Bulgaria's hellish plan to cover labor shortages. While towards the early 1980s, we start seeing such tendencies, for more than a decade, the goal of the programs was to train qualified personnel for the purposes of building of socialism in Vietnam. I'm actually not quite sure how many of you know this, but the suggestion that Bulgaria could train technical personnel for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was discussed prior to the official recognition of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam by Bulgaria. It was already in January of 1949 when the Politburo of the Bulgarian Communist Party approved the request of the head of the Vietnamese General Confederation of Labor, Le Duc Xin, to give Vietnamese workers the opportunity to come for technical training in Bulgaria. Almost 20 years later, on July 17, 1966, the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Pham Van Dong, sent the following request to Todor Zhivkov. And I'm not going to read it. These slides are barely for, illustration. But in this request, we see three mutually dependent urgent needs that rationalized what would eventually turn into a large-scale workers' exchange between the two countries. The creation of qualified personnel, the building of a socialist country and nation, and fortifying the resistance against the American aggression. Simultaneously, the Bulgarian embassy in Hanoi, around 1966, called the Vietnamese citizens to be trained in Bulgaria in, and this is a quote, favorable propagandists of our successes in the building of socialism. Of course, here propagandists it doesn't have a negative connotation. These urgent needs mark the origins of a complex of administrative procedure, norms, moral dilemmas, political infrastructures, even architectural decisions, subjectivities and discursive formations that would characterize the relations between Vietnam and Bulgaria in the years to come. These apparatuses, these dispositives, would eventually diffuse in everyday spaces, such as dormitories, production sites, transport, restaurants, universities, high schools, canteens, etc. The presence of Vietnamese students and workers in Bulgaria developed as a source of symbolic pride for the Bulgarian Communist Party and mass organizations, a testament to their devoted internationalism and a proof of their commitment to anti-colonialism and anti-racism. The interstate agreement signed in 1967 stipulated that 500 Vietnamese citizens would arrive for a period of 3 years. During this period, 6 months were devoted to their training in Bulgarian language and another 6 months to theoretical training in industrial production. Bulgaria assumed the responsibility for all of the expenses, with the exception of the travel between Hanoi and Sofia. And it covered the linguistic and professional training, work placements, outer garments, footwear, personal underwear, and stipends during the language training period. Once the trainees were assigned to their respective workplaces, they received wages under the same conditions as Bulgarian employees and workers. During their stay, the trainees also assumed all privileges that were guaranteed under Bulgarian labor and social legislation: free medical care, equal wages, social insurances in cases of temporary incapacity, illness, or accident, paid annual leave, and additional paid annual leave during Vietnam's official holidays. The agreement explicitly stated, however, that Vietnamese citizens could not arrive together with their families. So the first group of almost 500 Vietnamese citizens arrived in the early months of 1968. It was a very cold winter. 28 doctors, 12 nurses, 4 receptionists, 7 dispatchers, and 12 medical assistants welcomed the first group on the day of their arrival in Varna and immediately started treating the ill after very long days of travel for them. For the next 2 months, 3 dentists would treat those who had dental problems. And these gestures of friendship, as they were seen from the perspective of Bulgarian authorities, would sometimes produce even comic situations. A month into the language training, it became clear that many Vietnamese trainees experienced gastrointestinal problems as a result of the spontaneous decision of the main cook to mix Bulgarian and Vietnamese food products in a true internationalist culinary mixture. Of course, this internationalism in action, as it was called back in the day, did not take place without contradictions, without conflicts, and without resistance. As a result of the ongoing economic reforms, the managerial logic of economic enterprises often clashed with the political internationalist rationales behind the labor exchange programs. Vietnamese workers and trainees resisted as well. Some participated in labor sabotage by self-excommunication from work. Others refused to perform additional labor duties than what was written in their labor descriptions. Vietnamese citizens required even more internationalism in action than what was offered to them, and that is fairer involvement in the labor process, better arrangements of living conditions, close proximity to comrades and friends, and more practical knowledge in the building of socialism. And while conflicts between managers in enterprises and foreign workers occurred, the usual response of the Central Committee of the Bulgarian Communist Party was to require improvements within the ranks of political organizers, unionists, and youth organizations in light of their internationalist duties. The insistence on the political misunderstanding of internationalist duties among economic units and mass organizations, however, had the unintentional effect of demarcating the Vietnamese workers as a specific group that needed special attention. By the early 1980s, economic enterprises began sending annual reports concerned with the political measures taken by mass organizations in the education of internationalism among both Bulgarian and Vietnamese citizens, and also reports on the behavior of Vietnamese citizens. In this way, inadvertently, Bulgarian institutions created conditions for racialization precisely by this demarcation of Vietnamese citizens from the dominant social group as a group that is in need of a special political intervention. In the 1980s, we noticed a shift in the urgent needs that inform the arrival of Vietnamese citizens, a shift that little by little canceled Bulgaria's political, moral, and internationalist duties. Taking place during the growing debt crisis for both the Second and the Third World, in 1979, Todor Živkov's visit to Vietnam had the purpose to recollect Bulgaria's financial debt. Vietnam agreed to pay back loans made between 73 and 74 and to increase the number of Vietnamese workers in Bulgaria by more than 5-fold in order to compensate for the country's inability to repay the rest of its debt. In 1986, Vietnamese workers started repaying Vietnam's debt as Bulgaria was deducing 10% of their salaries. While on intergovernmental level, the labor exchange programs seems to have turned from an internationalist duty to a debt recollection affair, on the ground in small and average villages and towns, perhaps not Sofia, the Vietnamese citizens had become sought-after neighbors, friends, colleagues, and comrades. The internationalist morale that the Bulgarian Communist Party so fiercely fought for had finally taken roots. Friendships are, of course, not only dynamic and differentiated in their functions, but sometimes they also break. Already in 1989, the social fabric in Bulgaria started to change beyond recognition. As Eastern European countries sought to return to Europe and to restore capitalist forms of organization, we noticed the development of a semantic cross-pollination between foreigners and communists, which transformed foreign students and workers into an unwanted residue of the communist past. While foreign students were now represented by their equalization with the communist elite, the foreign workers were represented as an impurity that was impeding Bulgaria's unquestioned path towards a free market economy. These developments culminated in the mass and forced exodus of post-colonial nationals between 1990 and 1992. Already in December 1989, the Council at the Embassy of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, Nguyen Cung, raised the concerns of the embassy. Cung expressed his dissatisfaction with, and this is a quote, the propaganda found in some of the Bulgarian mass media, as such propaganda was one-sided and biased, creating negative attitudes and hatred. It was emphasized that Bulgarian youths mistreat workers, police officers carry out sudden passport checks, and inflict punishments because of work absences. In July 1990, the cabinet of Andrei Lukanov, this is the Bulgarian Socialist Party, passed a decision to create conditions for the accelerated return of the Vietnamese workers. I just want to mention here that Vietnam as well was pulling back workers, trainees, and eventually students. The new Socialist Party rationalized the decision as the party was afraid that the growing discontent will cause problems during the election campaign, as you can see from this slide. Between 1990 and 1991, the labor contracts were placed under malicious scrutiny in Bulgarian media. A true battle of meaning unfolded on the terrain of media narratives, where the Vietnamese laborers were caught in a race to the bottom between socialists and Democrats. While socialist newspapers were trying to salvage the dignity of those foreign workers left in Bulgaria, newspapers such as Democrația and Подкрепа were publishing materials with openly dehumanizing content, constructing a narrative according to which the Vietnamese citizens were stealing jobs and were one of the most difficult obstacles before Bulgaria's path towards a truly free market. By 1991, racial street violence had become intolerable as well. Simultaneously, in August 1991, the Council of Ministers took decision to suspend the stipends of foreign students, high school pupils, and PhDs who were admitted in the country by communist organizations that were dismantling at that time already. This created an international scandal and a very chaotic situation, as you can imagine, for thousands of students, and especially for those who arrived from the post-colonial world. That same month, under the so-called Cabinet of National Consensus, the Council of Ministers took another decision whose purpose was to carry out measures in order to prevent complications stemming from the large group of foreigners residing in the country. The citizens of 80 countries, among them Vietnam, were listed as potentially dangerous, in effect creating a post-socialist global color line. And I'm concluding here, and I would just like to say that if Walter Benjamin is correct, that the treasure of the past is buried in the present, then I hope we can remember that true political friendships are seldomly built around economic pragmatism, but around aspirations for a common, equal, and solidary future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Apostolova, for the very interesting presentation. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions and comments because you raised a lot of interesting topics here. Now it's time to give the floor to our second speaker, Ms. Nguyễn Đình Nu. She is a PhD student in the History Department of Columbia University, and her talk will be about the country of their youth, Vietnamese students in the People's Republic of Bulgaria, 1973-1991. Looking forward to it. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here today. It's my first time in Bulgaria, and I grew up hearing a lot about Bulgaria from my father, who's one of these students who came and studied and worked here for 10 years. This is a picture of him and his friends who left in the same year. And I carried out this project with my father. I mean, when I proposed it, I was thinking about it from like a historical perspective. This is something that is very interesting and very important to the study of the Cold War. I was still thinking in terms of the Cold War. I wrote that the transnational movement of students and workers between Bulgaria and Vietnam in the 70s and 80s was a crucial piece of Vietnam-Bulgaria diplomatic history and the broader history of the Cold War. But by engaging in this project, I want to shift the focus away from superpower contestations in order to kind of shed light on how smaller nations navigated the Cold War, and particularly how ordinary people traverse the international geopolitical landscapes that framed events beyond their control. So, who were the Vietnamese students that came to Bulgaria? And what did this journey mean to them and to the Vietnamese government that facilitated the exchange? The materials that my father and I collected offer a window into the emotional journeys undertaken by these migrants. I want to begin with a brief literature review, thinking about socialist internationalism in terms of brothers and friends. The term fraternal relationships came up a lot, but I want to talk about this from the Vietnamese perspective, especially from the perspective of Vietnamese diplomats. I included a portion from a report, a 1972 report on the situation, on the success or the lack of success sometimes of the migrant student worker exchange program in Eastern European countries, in socialist countries to be more exact. And I want to note the use of the term bạn, which means friend. And I think notions of friendship really undercut Vietnamese diplomacy. In a recent meeting, actually just before coming to this conference, with the Vietnamese ambassador to Bulgaria, and in the conversations that we had, she also constantly referred to Bulgaria as bạn. So this is how we see the world and see this relationship. But coming back to the literature, the English language literature that I was able to read in order to inform my lines of questioning coming into this project. Professor Apostolova talked about the ethos of internationalism and all of the complications that arise when two countries navigate this relationship that is economic but also highly symbolic. And then Theodora Dragostinova and Viktor Petrov talked about Bulgaria's long 1970s, Torozhikov vision of a cosmopolitan, modernized and globalized Bulgaria, what that means for Bulgarian culture and also what it means for Bulgarian computer science. And then Kristina Schwenkel talks about socialist mobilities, migration facilitated by the socialist state, and the wider context of the program that the Vietnam-Bulgaria exchange is a part of, with focus on Czechoslovakia and the GDR. And she challenges the capitalist framework of labor migration and argued that what happened in socialist states was different and requires a different approach. There's also Susan Bailey with the socialist acumen and the transfer of technical knowledge. And I think the piece that I reread the most is a rather small piece by Nguyễn, who's a professor at ANU, talking about how to navigate personal memories and ideas about the good life. The reason why it's so important to me is because the bulk of the material that I looked at ended up being personal accounts. But the theoretical framework that I resonated with the most was coming from Theodora Dragostinova. She wrote that Eastern Europe had nurtured other contacts with the world, which we forgot in the rush to join Europe. And she advocates for looking at these international connections, such as the 1968 Festival of World Youth, or the 1300th anniversary of the state of Bulgaria, and the fact that Bulgarian experts were sent to different parts of the world to help countries such as Nigeria and Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is socialist era internationalism really nurtured these international ties. And in the process, perhaps we could also revisit the history of modernization and how this process was implemented during the Cold War. And I think the most important thing for me was that this story shows that modernization in the Third World could scarcely be studied in national terms alone. And we must open it up to study transnational flows of goods and expertise and labor that enabled modernization in the Third World. And the archival documents that I looked at were explicit in showing that modernization in Vietnam was carried out in conversation with other countries in the socialist bloc, including and especially Bulgaria. The cohorts of people sent to Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea in the 1970s were considered the vanguard of this effort. They would learn how to operate factories that would be built by the socialist governments, that would host their education and practical training abroad, and then they would return. So I want to offer a kind of a personal window into this period and kind of center my talk on the migrants themselves and what they experienced. So I want to invite Nikolai to read this poem written by a Vietnamese student migrant who came to Bulgaria in 1975. The poem was written in Vietnamese and translated into Bulgarian by himself. Please.
Където живял в старите дни. Има едно място, че не се е родил, но носталгия цял живот ридаеше. Всеки градове и реките дълбоко възпомените. Колко години все още очаквам с нетърпение да се върне. Там, много пъти между огромен белия сняг, обичам родители на лаоски ветрове, изгаряне по лице, централна земя, гради дъжд, горещо слънце, когато си отиде далеч, мрачна носталгия.
Thank you. So what I wanted to highlight here is the fact that a lot of people who came to Bulgaria formed very strong emotional attachment to this country, despite the fact that they were not born here. And we'll return to this material and to this narratives later in the presentation. But I want to move on and talk a little bit about the archival sources that I used. So my father and I came to the National Archive number 3 in Hanoi, and we looked at documents from 1967 to 1993, which covers the entirety of the period where there exists like a formal labor and technical exchange program between Vietnam and Bulgaria. In the early period, information on Bulgaria are included in memos and reports on similar programs in the socialist bloc and in Eastern Europe. One document provides information on Bulgaria and 8 other socialist nations, including the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba, while another discusses the Bulgarian technical training and internship program within the context of a wider Soviet Union and Eastern European program. And then the bulk of the material is actually these personal accounts, because at the end of the day, a history that is based on documents alone is a particular kind of history that could be very detailed and thorough, but not complete. From the very beginning, I had wanted to use this opportunity as a chance to kind of delve into the life worlds and personal histories of those who are represented in the archival records as numbers. My father, again, facilitated my interviews and access to nearly all of the personal accounts that are collected. In the end, we have amassed a wealth of personal accounts that exist in various forms. Oral history interviews conducted by ourselves, published writing in book form, and unprinted web-based writing in the form of social media posts or WordPress. About the oral history, so in August this year, we traveled to Donghoi, Quảng to meet with a group of 5 Thực tập sinh and conducted extended interviews with them. They are from the former Bình Trị Thiên province, which is basically the most brutal and bloody battleground of the Vietnam War. Sorry. And also thanks to my father's role in the Vietnam-Bulgaria Friendship Association, we have in our family library a number of books on Bulgaria, either published by the association or self-published by the author. The poem that you've just heard came from one of those books. The richest source for these personal accounts are coming from Facebook. I collected writing from 3 people alone, and that's already 60 pages of content. So this is something that I'll have to continue doing after this conference. The reason why I think web-based content is so important is because a lot of people do not have access to publication. And also, the former cohorts use Facebook as a way to organize themselves and get in touch. So all of these personal sources shed light on the affective dimensions of the Vietnam-Bulgaria story, as well as fill out details that are not represented in the records. Like, for example, what was the journey like between Vietnam and Bulgaria? What cities did people go to? How did they deal with the differences in language, climate, and food? How did they keep in touch with their family? How were their lives shaped by the policies and disciplinary regime that are enforced in their schools, living quarters, and workplaces? How did they find love and build families? What was it like to leave Bulgaria? How do they remember Bulgaria? And what did it all mean? And conversely, there is much that is not captured by the personal materials. There are questions that scholars are more equipped to answer, such as, what did the technical and labor exchange program mean for international socialism? How was the program affected by shifts in geopolitics from 1967 to 1990, especially when it comes to Sino-Soviet relations, US-China rapprochement, and border wars in Vietnam? What role did international labor migration and transfer of technical expertise mean for the Vietnamese government's state-building prerogatives in the period after the Vietnam War? So I want to, this is one of the WordPress page. They built this whole website, and there are so many personal accounts on here, and it's impossible to trace in the records, in the archives now, where, like, the names of the people who came to Bulgaria, but the students and workers themselves kept these records, and you can see danh sách đoàn, that's where the names are listed. And then here are 2 of the people that I interviewed that were not in the first photo. And on this slide, I want to take the time to talk a little bit about one of the stories, one of the life stories of the student that came. So Bác Sự, who's not pictured here actually, was born in Vĩnh Linh, Quảng Trị. Vĩnh Linh is a town very close to the 17th parallel and suffered intense bombing in 1967. And because of the bombing, he lost his father. And then afterwards, he was sent to K8 in the north in 1973. It's a school for children of people who were who had some kind of contribution to the revolution.
Recording in progress.
And then in 1975, he finished, and then he was considered to go abroad. If he hadn't gone to Bulgaria, he would have stayed home and become a cadre. In all of the central area, only 2 people, him and another person who lost their father, was able to go to Bulgaria. And when he came to Bulgaria in 1975, and he left in 1978 because he did not like the climate. He was allowed to stay, but he wanted to come home. He was studying and working at the same time, and he was very good at theoretical lessons, even though his time learning the language was very short. He said that during his time in the dormitory, roommates would take care of each other when they were sick. When he came home in 1978, he was sent to my neighborhood to build the housing complexes there. And then because he missed home so much and because his family was suffering from a lot of hardship, he asked to come home to Guangxi again. And then in 1979, he was in Hanoi. And this is when the border clashes with China and Cambodia started happening. And he was almost sent to the border. But then they considered the fact that his hometown had already suffered so much losses. They let him go home. And he's been in Guangxi ever since. So another personal source of personal account I want to talk about is the this collection published by the Vietnam-Bulgaria Friendship Association. So from this collection, I can see that everybody remembers Bulgaria very fondly. Many calls Bulgaria their second homeland. And many were moved by the way they were received so warmly by the Bulgarian people. One man recounts how his host family organized a wedding for him, taking care of everything from the food to the decorations on the wedding car. And then another recounts how excursions to the countryside, where families vie for the opportunity to host Vietnamese students. Bulgarian people welcome Vietnamese students and workers as if they were family. And it really made an impression on the student workers who remembered it as something innocent and beautiful. So now, going back to the archival documents, who were they? The Thực Sing. Thực Sing is a specific term for the student trainees and interns who came to Bulgaria to receive technical training in vocational schools. And then worked in the jobs that they were trained for. As Professor Apostolova said, they came and received language training for 6 months, and then theoretical training for 6 more months. But in the interviews that I conducted, it was actually after 6 months, they just came to the workplace and they learned on the job. Although the official agreement says that 6 months, they will have 6 months of learning Bulgarian and then 3 years of working. In actual fact, a lot of people stayed for 6 years. So 3 years and then another extension, and some stayed for 10 years. If they reach 1980 and they still have the desire to return, they would be rehired in the next agreement. I also want to say Thực Sing does not cover everybody who came to Bulgaria during this period. This is for a very specific group of people who were trained to do industrial work in factories, work that goes towards industrializing Vietnam. And then here's an overview, kind of like a chart comparing the language of different agreements and memos. In 1967 and 1972, that was kind of like the pilot program, which is 450 people who were actually sent. And then from 1973 and 1975, just before the Paris Agreement was signed to end the war in Vietnam, the labor agreement between Vietnam and Bulgaria was signed, where 3,000 students would come to Bulgaria. In 1976, a memo stipulated that another 3,000 would be sent between 76 and 1980. I noted that from 1967 to 1980, the term used to refer to these people were always Thực Sing. But as many have noted, from 1980 onwards, the program changed dramatically. From throughout the 1980s, the Vietnamese student workers were referred to as workers. They were mostly workers. And numbers also increased dramatically from 17,000 between 81 and 85 to 12,000, or about 12,000 in 1986 to 1989. I got the number 12,000 from a memo signed in 1993, which ended the 1980 treaty, and recognized that all Vietnamese workers had been repatriated by December 1991. But this is not the full story. There are other Vietnamese people who remained students who were studying economics at Sofia University, for example, and workers who were not part of the treaty agreement. Another thing I want to note is the mode of transportation that people took in order to get to Bulgaria. So from 1967 to 1978, people took the train. So this is the Trans-Siberian train line that goes from, this is not it also, this is the Belt and Road. But the Belt and Road is based on the Trans-Siberian line that goes from Beijing across Mongolia, across Siberia to Moscow. And this train system does not exist in the same way anymore. But what this map, I wanted to pull up this map to show that the way that Vietnamese migrant student workers came to Bulgaria and Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s allows us to trace a network that is being reactivated right now. Because I don't have an answer for why, but the fact that it is. And so I think now is an opportunity to look back at that time and to see how we were connected. And anyway, the train. On the train, it took about 2 weeks. Yes, and by plane, it takes 24 hours. Because of the border conflict between China and Vietnam, from 1978 onwards, people could no longer take the train. Another thing that was not reflected in the records that I found was where people came to work. So here's a list of the cities, and the stars on the map are where they came. Here's another report on the exchange program in Eastern Europe, in Comecon countries. Actually, in socialist countries, not in Eastern Europe exclusively. So people were going to North Korea and China as well. And this is the numbers between 1967 and 1972. I must conclude now, but to be honest, I don't really have a good conclusion. I guess I can start here with this image of the 1974 Central Railway Station in Sofia. And I believe it's no longer like this. It's been demolished since 2012. But this is what my father and his friends would have seen when they first arrived in Sofia. And when I look at this, I feel a kind of strange familiarity. It feels like I know this kind of visual language. I've seen this kind of architecture in Vietnam. I've seen these shapes before. But I've never seen this in my life, and it's actually so far from Vietnam. So I guess I want to end with this image to kind of gesture towards a moment where we shared a visual language, an aspiration. And I hope that now we can continue to build bridges and to kind of revisit this moment of connection. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Nguyen. You're actually the proof, the living bridge between the people, and it's amazing how many decades later, you know, your father was here, and today you are here in Sofia University, you are speaking on an academic forum about this, and actually you have done a great research, and you see also in collaboration with Raia, so the living bridge is here. It's still alive, which is great, and I'm sure that there will be a discussion also about this. And Now I'm giving the floor to Professor Georgeta Nazarska to speak about the Bulgarian women's... Professor Nazarska is from the University of Library Studies and Information Technology, and she will speak about the Bulgarian women's movement in Vietnam in the 50s and the 80s, communist internationalism and or feminism. Professor Nazarska.
Thank you, Professor Christidi. I'd like to thank the organizers at first for the invitation to participate in this outstanding conference. My paper deals with international feminist movement through the Cold War, focusing on context between the women's movements in the two states in the period of 50s to 80s. The main research question is about the relations between the Bulgarian and Vietnamese women's movements in terms of feminism and communist internationalism. My paper analyzes archival documents and press and visual materials through approaches of history and women's history. This study is positioned in several important frameworks. At first, that is global. It includes the opposition of the West and the communist countries during the Cold War, decolonization process and pacifist movements during the first Indochina War and Vietnam War. And also consists of the second wave of feminism, which was also a polarized and divided movement at this period. The local framework takes into account the nation-state building and unification process in Vietnam and the establishment of a communist regime in it and close ties with the USSR and the communist countries. This framework includes the development of Bulgarian-Vietnamese foreign relations, which began since the diplomatic recognition of South Vietnam in 1950, with the exchange of ambassadors and the signing of economic, health and bilateral agreements in the 60s and 70s. At last, my paper takes account women's movements in both countries, which began their development under the leadership of their communist parties in the 50s. Both the Committee of Bulgarian Women's Movement and the Vietnam Women's Union were members of the Women's International Democratic Federation, a left-wing organization used by the USSR as a part of a palette of similar international networks for the purpose of global influence and also including the so-called Third War. I begin with bilateral ties between the Bulgarian and Vietnamese women's organizations. They were established in the beginning of 50s and facilitated by their increasingly close interaction with the local Communist Party states, whose satellites they became, and by their common membership in the World Federation. For example, the Committee of Bulgarian Women emphasized at its main goals the implementation of the foreign policy of the Bulgarian Communist Party, highlighting the advantages of communism and the fight against bourgeois feminist ideology. As a member of Federation, the Bulgarian organization was keen to closely coordinate its positions with the Committee of Soviet Women, and under its leadership and precisely implementing its suggestions provided support to the women's movement in the decolonized countries. During the period, the committee established purposeful ties with many countries, stimulated unambiguously advancing Bulgarian economic and political interests and facilitating the task of the USSR to increase the circle of satellite states. I mean countries in the Middle East, Latin America and Africa, but also to Vietnam. The relations between the Bulgarian and Vietnamese women's organizations were at first glance permanent and uninterrupted over time. They included formal and informal visits of delegations, which mostly rest in Bulgarian seaside and mountain resorts, and visited factories, cooperative farms, museums, and other sites. Vietnamese and Bulgarian women activists attended conferences and participating in the Federation workshops and congresses. However, the relations were highly formalized, updated on certain occasions, anniversaries and conferences, and were always under the supervision of the Federation, and during this 4-year period didn't include almost any discussions and initiatives regarding women's rights and or the status of women. In fact, the relationships mainly encompassed various protest and solidarity actions with the Vietnamese people during the two wars. They began in the 50s at the call of the World Federation to stop the war in Indochina. In 1969, the committee joined the newly founded Public Solidarity Committee, which included representatives of party states and all its satellite mass organizations. Its appeal, published in the press and read on the broadcasts, was responded to not only by the majority of women's councils in Bulgaria, but also by various military, economic, and cultural institutions, cooperative farms, military units, etc. Meetings condemned the American imperialism on inhuman aggression and demanded the end of the murderous, in brackets, shameful, dirty, barbaric, terrible, and etc. war. Lectures, film screenings, and rallies were held. Telegrams and appeals were sent to Bulgarian and international institutions. An idea to build a kindergarten in Hanoi with the raised money of 3,000 and 1,500 Bulgarian level was raised in the end of 60s, but realized in the beginning of 80s. This project worth 1.35 million Bulgarian level. And the kindergarten was opened in 1986. The Bulgarian branch committee also funded the general project of the Friendship Hospital for Mothers and Children in Hanoi, built by the World Federation. The solidarity campaign in favor of the Vietnamese people was also spread by the official magazine of the Bulgarian Women's Committee, the Woman Today. In the 60s and 70s, it published articles, translations, photos, and poems that presented the leaders of Vietnamese women's movement, emphasized heroism, and specifically described tragic stories of Vietnamese children. These pages of the magazine in Bulgarian were used for mobilization of women and in foreign languages for political suggestions of the communist bloc. Finally, I'd like to present some facts from the biography of the famous Bulgarian writer and later Vice President Blaga Dimitrova. In this case, microhistory is an appropriate methodology to understand how social processes are projected at an individual level. Blaga Dimitrova graduated Maxim Gorky Literature Institute in Moscow, and until the mid-50s wrote poems in praise of communist leaders Stalin and Dimitrov. In the beginning of 60s, her career was promoted by Bulgarian Writers Association, and she didn't have close ties with new political elites. In 1966, coming back from Cuba, she decided to follow the example of a number of her fellow writers and poets and visit Vietnam. She received assistance from the party leader Todor Zhivkov himself, and there in Vietnam she met with Ho Chi Minh and number of prominent state and party figures, including cultural figures. After her return, she published 4 books. Four books, Doomed to Love, The Last Judgment, Vietnam Diary, Underground Sky, and Anthology of Vietnamese Poetry. They were welcomed by the authorities, reprinted in large editions, and translated into foreign languages. From that moment on, Dimitrova entered politics. She was sent on 5 more visits to Vietnam, and as a delegate at the World Conference on Vietnam at Stockholm in 1967, and of the World Assembly of Paris for Peace and Independence of Indo-Chinese Peoples in 1972. She wrote also an open letter to John Steinbeck in 1967. The Women's Committee invited Dimitrova to become secretary of the Public Solidarity Committee, and she subsequently became an active figure in the state women's movement, for which she was awarded in the 1980s. The Dimitrova case is particularly revealing in a personal aspect. In 1966-67, she brought the Vietnamese little girl Ha Hoang from Haiphong to Bulgaria, whom she raised in her family. Official propaganda presented the case as an act of humanism and internationalism, saving a child from the war and adopting it, and the portraits and interviews of mother and daughter were printed everywhere. Since the 60s, not the Bulgarian authorities respect the process of child family, nor until her death Dimitrova didn't raise the issue of legalizing the custody or adoption of the girl, although she was already an adult. In conclusion, in the current state of art, there are 2 statements contradicted themselves. According to a group of scholars basing on a post-colonial approach, the World Federation was an organization designed to spread socialist ideology, developing transnational socialist networks dependent from the Communist Party state ideology and also by the Soviet Union. Other scholars on the ground of feminist studies maintain that the Federation was, on contrary, a left feminist organization in the global Cold War, part of the second feminist wave, an expression of the true feminism in Eastern Europe and the Third World, and an instrument for decolonization and anti-racism. Basing on my own study presenting here, I may conclude that Bulgarian Vietnamese women's movements in this period could be characterized both as state feminist organizations. On the one hand, they were completely satellite organizations in the totalitarian party states, supported by foreign policy, searched for allies, attracted material aid, and created symbolic capital. They were a mean of communist internationalism. On the other hand, practically, they could be put into the group of anti-colonialism and pacifist organizations. It was undoubtedly through its activities in so-called protest and supported actions. So it could be added to the so-called second feminist wave. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Nazarska. So we had 3 very interesting presentations. I'm sure that you will have questions or comments, of course. The comments are also highly appreciated. I know that we are running out of time, but I will give 15 minutes for discussion. And I will take advantage of my position of moderator to start with the questions first. So I have a questions to the 3 of the speakers. Of course, very short answers, of course, but I'm curious about the workers who came to Bulgaria and this exchange. My question is to Dr. Apostolova. Did the ideological reasons prevail over economical reasons in these agreements? And if so, how they affected people-to-people relations? So this is my question to Dr. Apostolova. To Ms. Nguyễn, my question is, does personal memories correspond, personal memories, the personal accounts that you mentioned, how do they correspond to the official narrative about this period? Corresponds to the official historiography? And my question to Professor Nazarska is, you spoke about women's solidarity in terms of the official organizations. And apart from the official level and press propaganda, have you encountered any examples of personal women's solidarity on daily basis? Thank you to all the speakers and of course, very short answers, and I'll give the floor to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I try not to think in such binary dual oppositions. I guess it is a complicated question because, of course, the building of socialism in itself is, let's say, an ideological issue. However, you need economic instruments in order to achieve such building of socialism, mutual building of socialism between the second and the third world. Now, what I would say, what I would answer here is that the political rationales behind in the beginning of the programs were extremely strong. We don't really see so much economic pragmatism. I would say it was actually, there was not, on part of Bulgaria in the late 60s, there wasn't really economic rationale behind the programs. However, what we see in the 90s, in the 1980s, we see that you know, Bulgaria is implementing rules throughout the agreements that do give us the idea that now they wanted to cover labor shortages. At first there were negotiations with Egypt, then with Vietnam. They chose Vietnam, that was already in the 70s. But So I'm not really sure how to answer this. And concerning the relations on day-to-day basis, well, of course, the archive, what we see in the archive is not only documents, right, like official documents, but we see discussions, we see conflicts, we see a correspondence between different administrative units and etc. And you can tell that there was quite a lot of conflicts in terms of how to implement the programs. What would they mean for the Bulgarian socialist project? What would they mean for the Vietnamese socialist project, as well as for this mutual building of socialism between the second and the third world? And I think that I'm not so well equipped to answer this question, but my colleague is in a much better position to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer and for referring to me. I don't know how much more equipped I am to answer that, but I want to at least attempt to answer your question about personal accounts and official narrative. I think one way in which, the personal accounts really fill in the details that are not available in the official narratives, but one of the ways that they come into conflict slightly is through the ways that the students and workers follow the rules at their dormitory. So I specifically, I'm talking about what really piqued my interest was accounts of love. So there's a major difference between the 60s and 70s period and the 80s period. Essentially, people who came in the 70s were not allowed to date each other, like other people in the cohort or other Bulgarians. But in the 80s, things were a lot more open. You have a lot of accounts of, I'm not Vietnamese marrying Bulgarians, but Vietnamese marrying other Vietnamese people who came to Bulgaria. So you see in the 70s, people I see a lot of personal accounts of almost love, like people were entertaining the idea of love, or they were dating, but like very discreetly. But then they always say, oh, but it never came to be. Otherwise, if we had pursued this relationship, then we would be sent back home. So that is not something that could be reflected in the account, in the official, in like the archive. But what we do see in the archive is that the disciplinary action were carried out, and people were being disciplined for things that we would not consider to be, just for falling in love. Yeah, so that's something that I noticed that I thought was interesting to bring up.
The propaganda and official level was on the one hand, but of course the other level were personal ties between people. So there's so many examples that these appeals and official propaganda touching people personal. For example, there's so many letters in archives from small villages. I remember a group Muslim women from Rodolfo Mountains that sent their own food supplies, baby clothes, sewing embroideries for Vietnamese women and children, or an architect who donated all his salary for this cause, or an adult woman from a small village that donated 10 leva. 10 leva was not so much, but it was 1/3 of her pension. I would like to add, of course, this example of Blaga Dimitrova. I think that the level of glory and this her writer's career was on one hand, but these personal ties with her daughter, Hannah, were concerned to the end of her wife, and to link the paper of our colleague, I personally remember these ties with Vietnamese students, especially with intellectual families. Some of them were donated also in this period of their study in Bulgaria also. So it's a very interesting contradiction and also relationship between these levels of propaganda and this anti-colonialist and pacifist movement that Bulgarian women entered in.
Thank you all for your answers, and now I give the floor to the audience, please. There is a mobile mic that I would ask to be... And could you please present yourself before asking the question?
Thank you so much. Stojo Tetevensky from the Sociology Department of Sofia University. I am a PhD candidate. I have a question for Raia. And first of all, I want to thank you, of course, all for the wonderful presentations. My question to Raia Apostolova is, during your research of archives of the 90s, of discourse of the 90s in the Bulgarian media, do you have an impression of how was this narrative of Vietnamese workers in right-wing media? How did it work together with the narrative, if it existed, of this return to internationalism? Because I am, of course, from a different generation, but my impression is that the narratives that are put forward are that after the fall of socialism, Bulgaria opened to the world. And what we consistently see is that this opening actually means opening towards West Europe, but closer towards the post-colonial world. So I wanted to see if this already existed as a narrative in the early 90s, and how did they reconcile with the fact that they were constantly racializing, actually, and exposing people from post-colonial worlds. And I don't have another question, but I do have a comment, if I can respectfully disagree with Professor Nazarska. I was left with the impression from your presentation that the Bulgarian Committee for the Bulgarian Women's Committee during their work was defending positions that were not feminist somehow, or not related to feminism. And I just want to respectfully disagree and say that in this time, this was a question of contestation itself. And I think that post-colonial countries and socialist countries were actually, in fact, successfully defending the position that, in fact, imperialism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and anti-war efforts are women's issues. And I think this is important to, not to question this narrative, because falling into kind of the West, judging from the West feminist positions, it seems like we are losing this history, if I understood you correctly. So I just wanted to say that I do think that they were viewed as women's issues, and they were successfully defended as such, for example, at the World Conferences on Women on the 3 ones before the fall of socialism. So I would just, wanted to express this. Thank you.
Maybe we could collect would you prefer to collect the questions to each one of you and then to give you the floor to answer, or you will prefer to answer one by one? Maybe we can collect some more questions. I saw someone. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for the wonderful presentations. My name is Kalina Andrenska. I am with the feminist organization called LEFEM. My question goes to Nguyễn, and building on Stojo's question. How was this shift, or maybe was there a change in the perception of Bulgaria in Vietnam after this racialized violence started by the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s towards Vietnamese workers and students in Bulgaria? So was there a change in the way Bulgaria was perceived in Vietnam, in the official, or not only the official, but in general in Vietnam? And I just wanted to say that it is not only that back in the back during socialist time, it was feminism was also a matter of anti-war resistance. I mean, literally last year, the feminist protests on the 25th of November was against the genocide in Palestine. This was one of the main topics. So feminism nowadays is also very much, part of the anti-war struggle. Thank you.
Thank you. Some other questions? Because our speakers are collecting now questions, so they will answer to them. Okay, maybe I can give them the floor, and if you have more, we'll raise your hand. So maybe we start first with Dr. Apostolova.
Thank you for the question. Well, I first would like to say that there were, around the 60s, the beginning of the 60s, there were efforts, very conscious efforts to color our socialist societies, to color everyday practices, to color legitimate political voices. And let me give you one story. In 1963, quite a lot of students from Africa left Bulgaria in disgust, because when they tried to organize an All-Africa Union, that was not possible. I'm not going to go into details, but they were also complaining by racial discrimination on the streets. So they left quite a lot of African students left Bulgaria. And that was shocking for the Bulgarian Communist Party, for the mass organizations, for the student unions, etc., etc. You can imagine what a shock that was, because obviously one of the symbolic sources, one of the sources for the symbolic power of the socialist state was its anti-racism, anti-colonialism, etc., etc. And what happened in 1963 was that there were intentional efforts to color our everyday spaces and political legitimate voices. What that meant? That meant that foreign students and workers had to talk more frequently in medias. Newspapers had to publish about the colonialism and anti-colonial efforts in the Global South. It meant that foreign students had to go through production plants and factories and to speak their stories. I mean, there was quite a lot of effort on part of mass organizations and the state to what I call coloring the socialist spaces, with the exception of the youth organization. This is another story. So let's go to the 90s. It seems to me that the 90s, what we see is a process of decoloring, process of whitening of these spaces. And it is not by, this is why I mentioned the redrawing of these post-socialist color lines, because now all of a sudden it seems to me that we had to eradicate what was taking place before 1989, and we had to return to Europe, but we paid the price. We paid the price as a society because we turned our backs to the Global South. I think that I will finish here.
Okay, thank you. Gwen, please.
I don't think I'm equipped to answer your question about Bulgaria, perceptions of Bulgaria in 1990s Vietnam, because I was looking at sources that end in the early 1990s. I guess that's really all I can offer right now. But perceptions of Bulgaria and Vietnam right now is really good, and I don't think mentions of racial discrimination suffered by the workers in Bulgaria had come up. I wonder if it's because they did not come back to Vietnam and instead migrated to another European country, and that's why these stories did not get to circulate. But I was honestly astonished to learn of what had happened, and this is my first time hearing about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Nazarska. A few words from you.
Yeah. Very shortly, you have your arguments to disagree with my conclusions because you have the perspective of post-colonialism. I tried to combine these perspectives because according to feminist studies, the anti-colonialist agenda was one of the main slogans, one of the main issues of second feminist wave in the 60s and 70s. That is why these activities, you know that they were very politicized and under the dependence of communist parties and other factors could be put in this feminist discourse. Thank you.
I would like to thank all the speakers, and I will allow myself just a few sentences to conclude. And allow me to conclude with a personal story, because I have one. I have personal memories. From the 80s, I was a child, and although I'm from here, from Sofia, I don't remember the Vietnamese people here in Sofia, but I very clearly remember when I visited my grandmother in a provincial city of Biała Slatina, which is close to Wraca Kneža, which I saw in your list in the documents. So I remember very clearly there were a lot of Vietnamese workers living in this provincial city. They were accommodated in the only hotel which was modern for that time in the center of the town, so they lived there. And my grandmother raised chickens. So I remember the Vietnamese people coming to buy chickens from her. And what I remember very clearly is the attitude of the people in this conservative old town, because the Vietnamese people were very exotic for them. But the whole perception was that these are very good people, hardworking, they do not create any troubles in the town, they are very honest, and they pay well, you know, for the chickens and for everything. So I can, here is my personal testimony that the Vietnamese people were accepted and respected. So I think it's a good conclusion to our meeting, and I'm sure that you can continue the discussion with our panelists in more informal conversation after this session. So I would like to thank you all for the great contributions, and also to the audience. And now I am officially closing this very interesting round table. Thank you very much, and thank the panelists.